Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 7 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 7 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor.
Господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги.
Distinguished Mr. President, distinguished delegates, the vote on the immediate ceasefire and on an unequivocal condemnation of the indiscriminate attack did not get past. Those delegations who either abstained or voted against essentially were against the cessation of a bloodshed in the Middle East. There can be no other explanations of it. Of course, the colleagues here saying, well, their justification was not balanced. But all of these complaints are just going to be empty. You've made your choice, however, and you are going to have to bear responsibility for it to the countries, people of your countries, and to the people in the region, and the people who are living under this terrible, deadly threat. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. It is my understanding that the Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 submitted by Brazil. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 please raise their hand? Will those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 12 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. The draft resolution, no. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. Dear colleagues, at last Friday's closed consultations, Council members asked for Brazil's leadership in our capacity as presidents in October to facilitate a Council response to the escalating crisis in Israel and Palestine, in particular its humanitarian aspects. We heeded the call with a sense of urgency and responsibility. In our view, the Council had to take action and to do so very quickly. Council paralysis in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe is not in the interest of the international community. Therefore, throughout last weekend and the following days, we worked very hard through extensive and collaborative engagement with Council members to help build a unified position. While making a good faith effort to accommodate different, sometimes opposing positions, our focus was and remains on the critical humanitarian situation on the ground. Political realism guided us, but our sight was always set on the humanitarian imperative. Exactly as in other very sensitive files on the Council's agenda in which Brazil had a special role to play, international humanitarian law and human rights law provided a clear framework for action. Our proposed text unequivocally condemned all forms of violence against civilians, including the heinous acts of terrorism by Hamas and the taking of hostages. It called for their immediate and unconditional release. It also called on all parties to strictly abide by their international legal obligations, in particular those relating to the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel. The draft resolution also stressed the urgent need for humanitarian access to civilians. The text incorporated urgent and multiple calls by the UN and many other actors for humanitarian pauses to allow for the delivery of aid and the voluntary safe passage of civilians. It encouraged the establishment of humanitarian corridors and other mechanisms to facilitate the smooth delivery of aid. The draft further reflected the ethical necessity to provide civilians in Gaza with electricity, water, fuel, food, and medical supplies. The necessity to be protected from forced relocation when the prevailing conditions on the ground do not ensure a safe and secure displacement. Thus, faced with heinous terrorist acts against Israeli civilians, with the forceful reaction to such acts and an ever-growing humanitarian disaster imposed on Gaza, the Council response we proposed was robust and balanced. We are grateful to all Council members who engaged with us since last Friday and demonstrated a sincere and practical commitment to multilateralism. Sadly, very sadly, the Council was yet again unable to adopt a resolution on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, silence and inaction prevailed, to no one's true long-term interest. While we deeply regret that collective action is made impossible in the Security Council, we do hope that efforts by other actors will yield positive results. They must be prompt, effective, and substantial. Hundreds of thousands of civilians in Gaza cannot wait any longer. Actually, they have waited for far too long, to no avail. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. And I'll give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, we have just been witnesses once again of hypocrisy in the double standards of our American colleagues, not standing in principle in the Security Council. They really did not want to have any solution found here. So because of this, they had to just be very obvious as to what their intentions were before us here all today. Now, I'm not going to waste your time going on about this. I think it's crystal clear what's happened, but I would just like to talk about what the head of Lockheed Martin, James Head, said yesterday, talking to the American media. He said there's no point in restraining Israel from any military actions. What is the point in the future development of our military-industrial complex, which will increase by at least 2% of GDP? there are conflicts which need to be resolved with arms, and we are prepared to provide these arms, these weapons, end of quote. As we say, no comment. Really, that is the very essence of the US's policy in the region and the Pacific region. We do hope that thanks to that, our international partners, after today's votes, will have no illusions about that and what they're intending whatsoever. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, as we meet, President Biden is in the region. His trip is a clear demonstration of the fact that the United States is actively engaging at the highest levels to secure the release of hostages, to prevent the conflict from spreading, to stress the need to protect civilian lives, to address the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza, and to demonstrate to the Israeli people that the United States stands with them in their time of sorrow and need. We are on the ground doing the hard work of diplomacy, and while we recognize Brazil's desire to move this text forward, we believe we need to let that diplomacy play out, especially when Secretary General Guterres, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and regional actors are engaged in intensive dialogue on the very issues we are deliberating on today. Yes, resolutions are important, and yes, this Council must speak out, but the actions we take must be informed by the facts on the ground and support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives. The Council needs to get this right. Colleagues, the United States is disappointed this resolution made no mention of Israel's rights of self-defense. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the inherent right of self-defense as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Following previous terrorist attacks by groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this Council reaffirmed that right. This text should have done the same. Though we could not support this resolution going forward, we will continue to work closely with all Council members on this pressing issue, just as we will continue to reiterate the need to protect civilians, including members of the media, humanitarian workers, and UN officials. And when I talk about the protection of civilians, I mean all civilians. The United States is horrified and saddened by yesterday's explosion at the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. We mourn this tragic loss of life. On the humanitarian front, we are working with Israel, its neighbors, the United Nations, and other partners to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It is critical that food, medicine, water, and fuel begin flowing into Gaza as soon as possible. Families, the elderly, and children are in dire need. Let's be clear. Hamas's own actions have brought this on, this severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And Hamas has caused so much needless suffering, death, and destruction. Every member state should condemn Hamas's terrorism and cruelty, and every member state should call on Hamas to cease its endless barrage of rockets against Israel. This is not complicated. It's not controversial. This is the bare minimum. Colleagues, at this difficult moment, let us all call for the protection of civilians and unequivocally condemn Hamas. Let us all affirm Israel's right of self-defense and support the urgent diplomatic efforts underway. Let us stand with the UN and other partners as they work to alleviate the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza. And let us all support equal measures of justice and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta voted in favor of the draft resolution tabled by Brazil. Malta has also abstained on the 2 amendments proposed by the Russian Federation. Although we have no issue with the substance, we saw no reason to alter a well-crafted resolution that rests on a delicate balance and that sought Council unity on this critical matter. We deeply regret that We deeply regret that the draft resolution was not adopted and remain gravely concerned at the highly volatile situation in Israel and Gaza. Notwithstanding this decision, the Council must critically remain seized with the matter and strive to work towards constructive steps which prioritize the protection of civilians and prevent any potential regional conflagration. Within this context, Malta unequivocally condemns in the strongest possible terms the barbaric terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on Israeli soil and against the people of Israel. Malta emphasizes that Israel has the right to self-defense in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks. It has the right and obligation to protect its territory and its people in line with humanitarian and international law and the principles of distinction and proportionality. We also reiterate our call on Hamas to unconditionally and safely release the hostages immediately. President, we deeply regret that casualties of this war have already included numerous medical, humanitarian and UN staff. Hundreds were killed in yesterday's horrific strike on the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza that was sheltering thousands of displaced. Such actions are deplorable. They are a blunt breach of international law which categorically prohibits endangering civilians, medical staff and humanitarian establishments. This is the inevitable result of the military operations that are being conducted in Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. Decisions to cut off electricity, water supply and refuse supplies of aid and fuel are also deeply concerning and are leading to catastrophic results. The evacuation order, which displaced over 1 million people to South Gaza, has had serious humanitarian consequences. Such decisions are inconsistent with international humanitarian law and must be rescinded. Malta also stresses the crucial importance that there be a rapid, unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza and urges the immediate establishment of humanitarian corridors in this regard. At this juncture, the importance of preventing a regional spillover is critical. It is therefore imperative for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and fully comply with the norms of international law. Our efforts moving forward must be steadfast in aligning with a just and comprehensive resolution of the Middle East conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the night before last, I already gave a comprehensive account of China's views on the current situation in Palestine and Israel. In the next emergency meeting, I shall elaborate on China's position. I shall focus on China's position on today's vote, on the fact that the draft resolution failed to be adopted, and our reaction is that of shock and disappointment. The night before last, the Russian resolution focused on the situation in Palestine and Israel, focusing on the protection of civilians, and that resolution adopted received a lot of support from countries. However, some countries have chosen to cast a negative vote. The reason given at the point was that they were actually more intended to base their positions on the resolution tabled by Brazil as such get more time to deliberate. The colleagues from Brazil and other colleagues have agreed to that request by postponing the meeting for another 24 hours. And now it's been proposed again to this point. Over the past 40 hours, they have neither commented on nor expressed opposition to the Brazilian draft, and which led us to expect that today, hopefully, they will vote in favor of this resolution, and the Council will be able to adopt the resolution favorably. However, the final result of the vote is nothing short of unbelievable. It is also the belief of China that the Brazilian resolution still has rooms for improvement. It should send a strong message asking for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, China has proposed amendments that are intended to improve the draft, while at the same time agreeing with the Russian amendments. The Russian amendment, the fact that it will fail to be adopted, we are simply very disappointed. That being the case, in view of the fact that the situation in Gaza is deteriorating rapidly, what happened yesterday, that is the airstrike on the hospital and things like that, resulted in civilian casualties in the hundreds. Therefore, the Council has to take rapid actions. China condemns strongly the airstrike against hospitals, and we urge Israel to effectively abide by the obligations under the international humanitarian law. We call for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent further civilian casualties. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil in general reflects the general view of the international community, representing the initial steps to be taken by the Council to achieve a ceasefire. And they could be possibly the only possible draft that the Council can reach consensus on under the current circumstances. Some countries are already saying that the Council should take a correct action. However, the way they voted on the text in question makes us doubt their willingness for the Council to take real actions and their willingness to find a solution to the problem. In the final analysis, the Council should not stand on its hands. The current situation in Gaza is escalating. More and more civilians are paying the prices with their lives and is bearing the brunt of the conflict. And therefore, on the question of ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and protection of civilians, the Council has to effectively shoulder its responsibility and play its due role. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend Brazil and your presidency for the excellent leadership in conducting this work, which is thorny but important. We also thank you for providing the Security Council with a very valuable text. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. We deeply regret that the draft could not be adopted due to a veto. In voting in favor, Mozambique wishes to express our deep concern over the outbreak and escalation of violence and deterioration of the situation in Gaza, and consequently the unfolding humanitarian crisis. Moreover, we are deeply concerned about the human lives that are being lost on a daily basis since the conflict erupted. The civilian population, mainly children, women, and the elderly, are suffering the most from the atrocities and grave effects of this world. In supporting this resolution, Mozambique associates herself with the collective efforts of this Council aimed at ensuring the protection of civilians and the respect for international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, as applied to this conflict both in Gaza and in Israel. It is our strong call that humanitarian aid must reach the needy populations in Gaza. That includes the provision of essential goods and services, as well as medical supplies. Mr. President, we are conscious of the fact that ultimately humanitarian problems need political solutions. This belief reflects our own experience, originated from our protracted struggle against colonialism, racism, and apartheid in the Southern African region. In this context, we urge all the parties to immediately stop attacks, refrain from further violence, and engage in constructive dialogue. Mozambique firmly believes that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their differences through dialogue. We hold the view that peace is always possible if the conflicting parties are genuinely willing to follow the path of justice and tolerance. We therefore wish to reiterate our appeal to the members of this Council to redouble our efforts toward a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We believe the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have their inalienable right to statehood. They can live together, side by side, in peace and security as good neighbors. As a matter of fact, the Charter compels the parties, and indeed the entire international community, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
I thank you, Mr. President, and let me begin by thanking your presidency and all delegations for the efforts made to have a consensual resolution that could have helped support the efforts of this Council to de-escalate the rising tensions and respond to the tragic situation that we are all witnessing in the Gaza Strip and in southern Israel. We deeply regret that the resolution could not pass. For Ghana, we have always held that the Council should, as far as possible, speak in one voice on this important dispute, whose fault lines reach many distant parts of the world. We have therefore from the very beginning given priority to the efforts entrusted to the presidency to lead all of us in that direction. It was in this regard also that we voted in favor of the Brazilian draft resolution, but deemed it important to abstain from the draft resolution proposed on Monday night and the amendments to today's resolution to preserve the broadest possible agreement that was found to guide us in a common direction. Despite the high sensitivities of the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the differences in approaches we may have in resolving it, what should be paramount is our historic responsibility as a Council to deliver the two-state solution and preserve the lives of the two nations whose destinies are bound by history and a common and shared area. The Council's inability to act on its responsibility today, however, should not break our resolve. We believe that a united Council voice and action on the matter is still required and critical in stabilizing the situation and assisting the parties to enter into dialogue, which is the only viable path to durable peace. We should therefore continue to ask the parties to de-escalate, seek consensus to support mediation efforts, and knock on the doors of all those that can have a moderating influence on the parties to open up the space for dialogue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan voted in favor of the resolution because it can support its main ideas, bearing in mind various perspectives, including the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Japan has unequivocally condemned the terror attacks by Hamas and others, and called for the immediate release of those who were kidnapped. We feel strong indignation at the tremendous damage and harm to innocent civilians brought by the attack on a hospital in Gaza City on the 17th. At the same time, we would like to point out that Japan had asked to delay the vote on this resolution proposed by Brazil, understanding that various countries, including the United States, have been continuing to make diplomatic efforts on the ground to improve the situation as soon as possible. Japan expresses its great regret at the fact that the resolution was voted to a vote today nevertheless. Japan has consistently and strongly supported and put a face in diplomatic efforts by US President Biden and other relevant countries. All of us, including those who refer to hypocrisy in particular, should think twice if we are really faithful to human rights principles and if we are doing sufficient efforts to make difference on the ground in improving humanitarian situation. Actions are needed. Japan will continue to work together with other countries to ensure the safety of civilians and realize an early de-escalation of the situation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. On the 7th of October already, Switzerland firmly condemned the terrorist acts, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli people. We deplore the deaths of thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly Gaza. Switzerland echoes the Secretary General in condemning unequivocally these strikes, particularly those which, according to United Nations figures, have led to hundreds of deaths and dozens of injured yesterday in the Al-Ahli Hospital, Anglican Episcopal Church, and we express our sincere condolences to the injured and the victims. We are concerned regarding the large-scale humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the dramatic situation faced by civilians. Almost 1 million people have been displaced, and it is urgent for humanitarian aid to be able to enter. Water, electricity and medical supplies are dwindling. We have all spoken around this table yesterday about the situation in the Middle East, which requires united, urgent action by the Council. De-escalation, protection of civilians, humane treatment for all hostages, and Switzerland calls for immediate release, as well as rapid, safe, unhindered humanitarian access are all priorities. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil met these priorities, with aiming for a common understanding by this Council, which is why we voted in favour of it and very much regret the failure to adopt the resolution put to the vote today. I wish to thank your delegation once again, President, for your sustained commitment. It is regrettable that we have not yet been able to reach consensus on a product showing our unity in the face of this situation. Independently of the adoption of a resolution, all the parties must uphold international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, as well as human rights. International humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military needs.
All of these rules must therefore be respected with no exception. President Switzerland has deployed every effort to contribute to reaching consensus on a Council product in this urgent situation. Along these same lines, we remain at your disposal to support any new initiatives which could result in action by this Council. Thank you.